in my chair.
Okay, well, we're live on the channel. Okay. As a warm-up conversation, before we get into the heavy stuff, let's talk about what we're going to do next. So I had originally decided to do like a 6 to 8 weeker on quote-unquote American Christianity. I changed my mind. Well, so I thought about it quite a bit, and I realized that the thing that I've been enjoying here the last 8 weeks or so, or I guess 12 weeks, is that we've been having good conversations. And the topic of the history of American Christianity, while very fascinating to me especially, I think would end up being more of a lecture series and less of a conversation series. So that being said, any suggestions? Any ideas on what we study? And keep in mind that my priority right now is kind of maintaining this vibe, this debate form, not debate really, but the conversation, the back and forth that we've been achieving.
That's what I like about this class.
Yes.
I get to talk.
Yes. That's it.
I can hear you better here than I can in church.
This room is much easier to balance sound-wise too. Yeah. Pat said, "This is what I like, is I get to talk." So as do all. Here, okay. Well, let me just toss out a couple of thoughts that I had. So whenever we're looking at something new, we've always got the Bible to fall back on, right? We could either do a book that we haven't done in a while, or we can do something new. And I was looking back through my notes, and we've done pretty much everything. With the exception, we haven't touched some of the epistles. We could totally pick one of the Pauline letters, or we could even do a survey of the Pauline epistles in general. We haven't touched Hebrews, but honestly, I don't really want to do Hebrews if I'm being blunt. And it's not. Hebrews is a theological paper. It's not a letter like the Pauline epistles. It is very much an early theologian writing about theological ideas applied to Jesus, which is great, right? There's a lot of value there, but it doesn't. I don't know. We could do Hebrews, I guess. We did Revelation. Man.
One thing I'd be kind of interested in, we all hear about the Acts of the Apostles and there's these little stories and stuff. But really, if you read through the whole book, there's quite a tale
Yes.
there about, kind of all the things that they did to kind of get the formation of the church going, like James having the church over in Jerusalem and, the rest of them going off to other places and stuff. And then even take that one step further and think about, the Acts of the Apostles ends at a certain point. I can't remember exactly where, but what happened after that? Where did all these guys go? Where are these 12 apostles? I mean, I read a book here a number of years ago about sort of legends of where there's the one about one of them ending up in Spain, and there's another one about them going to India.
Yeah, that would have been.
Like that. Now that might all be hokum.
Yeah. I think it was Thomas supposedly ends up in India, there's some weight to that though, believe it or not, because so I have a friend, Chandra, who's from the Indian subcontinent, and he can point out, the parts of Indian culture that have been heavily influenced historically by Christianity, and there still to this day are, essentially myths surrounding, the idea of early Christian disciples coming over.
Well, if you read the stories of some of the early
Yeah.
When they first ran into the Indian culture there, one of the things they noted in their writing was how many similarities there are between, say, the design of some of the churches and some of the things that they subscribe to and that kind of thing. And it kind of follows on what you were just saying.
Yeah, and well, and what was I reading recently? I was reading something recently that was talking about kind of from a modern perspective how we very much underestimate the amount of communication that occurred between peoples in what we refer to as ancient times. But, well, if you go visit Lyon, France, right, which is the end of the Silk Road, you will very much appreciate actually how much culture, communication, technology is transferred simply by that one, trading route. Lyon has I did a presentation on this after we got back from, no, it wasn't after Sabbath. Yeah, maybe it was, no, I don't know, whatever. But they have the Silk Museum in Lyon, and you can actually see all of these different, basically art-inspired textiles that are, anyways. Okay, let me summarize what you just said, because I think this might actually be what we end up doing. So this actually, I like this idea, man. Paul, you just walked in. We were talking about what we're going to study next. I changed my mind. I was going to do a history of American Christianity, and another time. Another time. I don't want to do it for many reasons.
You can do it sometime.
I'll do it sometime. Yeah. Here's what I'm thinking, because this is great. Okay, so this course is about putting together a discipleship model based on the Gospels, right? And I had talked at the beginning about we might get into Acts. I had set an end date. We're going to wrap this up by next Sunday, right? It's not that it's dragging. I've really enjoyed the conversation, but we're reaching to the point where we're running out of real estate, scripture-wise, because this morning I fully intend to cross a bunch of things off of this. This dovetails nicely because we could, after we have put together our model of discipleship, not that we're going to end up with a concrete thing, but after we finish this conversation, we could jump right into what did they do, right? So I think it'd be fun to read. We did Acts, I don't know, 5 years ago, something like that. But we could read through the Acts narrative again. But this time what we'll do is we'll pay attention to the characters, right? So we'll break out, what Peter's up to, Philip, we can track all of these dudes. Even the guy that got drawn by lots, right? The one they flipped a coin for.
I was just going to say, I think there's also a huge hole in people's thoughts about that huge North African Christian presence prior to Islam. Augustine is the best remaining representative, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, from Carthage there.
Yeah.
But that's very, very significant part of Christianity that we really are ignorant about. Yeah, I'm just going to say that.
What?
And especially the Coptics.
Yeah.
And their very valid claim to be the oldest continuous, right, Christian presence in the world.
What if we did? This might take the whole summer. Because what if we did this, but then we went past the narrative of Acts, the narrative timeline of Acts, and we looked into, let's say, the Christian expansion up to maybe 325, right, up to Constantine.
Yeah, that's why they follow up.
Yeah, that would be fun. Okay, that's what we're doing. We'll start the first Sunday in May, right? This week is the 23rd, next week is the 30th. Boom, first Sunday in May. That's what we're gonna do. I'll start
Maybe the second Sunday becomes more realistic.
Or the
Second or third. What's not set in stone yet. I do need some time to do some research. Well, this part I've got material for, but once we get into looking at, because we could look at the cities that Paul and others are writing letters to as well, right? We could look at Carthage, we could look at Philippi, we could look at Ephesus, Galatia.
Are you gonna do a travel on with it?
This will be a Rick Steves style. This is what we're gonna call it. This is Rick. But no, I don't want to get copyright claimed, especially for live streaming. I'll call Rick Steves. See if he'll do something. He's Lutheran. Did you know Rick Steves is dating or at least married to the bishop of the Southwestern Washington Synod?
Really?
Yeah. He's about Lutheran as it gets. Yeah. Okay. Great. Got it. Okay. Let's talk about this stuff. So a quick recap, we took a week off, well, a couple of weeks off into Easter. Here's what we talked about so far. We have done a lot of quote unquote foundational work, right? So we have talked about how one is drawn into discipleship, right? The process for getting there. We threw out a bunch of qualities that might describe disciples. Again, the one that I'm still coming back to in my thinking.
Could you just put PL in discipleship?
No cigar.
It's just me.
Would you believe that I'm taking a course in professional editing right now?
You're editing all right.
But it's funny, well, what was it here or was it in the sermon I talked about, the fact that my wife listened to a podcast or read an article about how there's no such thing as true multitasking, right? Is that our brains simply don't function that way. We can hop back and forth between tasks, but we can't actually think two separate things at the same time.
Speaking of your wife, how did she do?
Oh yeah, she did amazing. So Elen ran a 4 hours and 7 minutes marathon, which is fabulous. Which is it's not a mixed bag. Her qualifying marathon that she ran in Washington back in June of last year was a 3 hours and 35-minute marathon, right? So 4 hours and 7 minutes is slower than that, but considering that she only had a month to train, basically, is remarkable. And her goal pace was actually to do 9 or 10-minute miles, which have been around 4 hours and 20 odd minutes. So this was great. I'll talk about it in the sermon today.
Why don't you just have a little bit of service?
Yeah. No, it'll fit into the text, I promise. I'm not just shoehorning in my wife's achievements to win over the hearts and minds of the congregation. No, but it's a great trip too. Boston is super cool. I've never been before. And we walked the Freedom Trail, so we started over at Boston Commons, went all the way up. So I got to walk the decks of the USS Constitution, which was maybe my favorite part. I thought that was pretty stinking neat. We had so we have friends in Portland whose parents live in Lexington, and so Lee came and picked us up and gave us a tour of Lexington Concord. Got to see the first battle of the Revolution. It was pretty cool. If we had been there on Monday, Patriots Day. You know about Patriots Day? It's a holiday that only exists in Massachusetts because they celebrate the opening salvo of the Revolutionary War. And the Patriots Day coincides with the Boston Marathon. So as I dropped Ellen off the start line and I was walking back, and there was a parade coming through. They start the Commons and then they go all the way to the site of the Boston Massacre. That's where so I saw the site of the Boston Massacre, which when you study this stuff in school, in my brain, I'm imagining, 50 people killed. It's like 5, but which to be cynical, that's a regular occurrence in our world, that kind of mass shooting. But super cool. And what else did we see? I mean, we walked Much to my wife's complaint, we walked a lot, even after the marathon. Wow, we saw Harvard, MIT, checked out those campuses. Yeah, took the ferry, did all this stuff. Had a great time.
What is the next marathon she's gonna run?
See, this is the problem. I thought we were one and done with Boston, right? Because it was such a traumatic experience, all the way from training for the qualifier race, to running this, being injured. And I imagined that once we were through this, no more. And the first thing she said to me is, well, I got to figure out how I'm going to qualify again next year. Great. All over again. It is an experience. I got to say, though, my one marathon up in Victoria, you see people at the start, you obviously see people at the finish, but then over the course of the race, you'll see scattered people, right? And obviously, the bigger the marathon, the more people are attached to it. The remarkable thing about Boston was that from the beginning to the end, it's people packed shoulder to shoulder along the route. There is never a section where there aren't people cheering you on, which even for me, it was an emotional experience, because it's like, wow, this is amazing. And I think, too, to be honest, I think it was a 10-year anniversary of the bombing as well, is that traumatic event had the opposite effect, in that it galvanized that community into caring for this thing that's so much a part of their process. Anyways, so it was great. I'll talk about it more during the sermon. Okay. Okay. We talked about where do disciples come from? Are there qualities that should be desired in a disciple? Several that came up. I'd still like the idea, maybe because I came up with it, that curiosity is core to this. And I'm being a little bit snarky here, but more and more that I think about it, I reflect that for me at least is one of the major traits that's missing from so much of modern Christianity, is we have lost the ability to be curious about not only the world around us, but our own faith, right? We've become convinced, and I'm obviously talking about the big we here. This is not us specifically. It's the whole mass of American Christianity, but that we've lost the capability to become curious about our own faith, right? We're so convinced that we have orthodoxy in hand, that we have got the right ideas, that there is no longer any space to be surprised, even. So, anyways, talk about that. So, the past 2 weeks before Easter, before Palm Sunday, we had some amazing conversations, primarily talking or exploring around, number one, the commissioning of the disciples. What does that have to teach us? If we're translating the experience of the commissioning, sent out 2 by 2, vulnerable, how does that translate into our experience? What are lessons or practices that we can take away from that? The week before Palm Sunday, or the week before Holy Week, we had a wonderful, wonderful conversation as a follow-up to that, talking about who gets to be disciples, right? We track the tax collectors, and what does it mean that sinners, that being a sinner seems to be a requirement for being a disciple. Jesus saying, I came to save sinners, not the righteous. So,
He didn't have any choice.
Didn't have any choice. Yeah.
We're all sinners.
Yeah. And that is such a simple statement, but actually the most important one, for me, it goes along with that curiosity piece as well, too. So here's what we're going to do today and next week. We've got 2 weeks to look at this stuff. We're going to talk about practices. Okay, so we're talking about building a model of discipleship. Again, that's a strong word. We're not nearly that concrete, but we're going to talk about. So what do we do? What are we called to participate in? Right? What are the 10 habits of highly motivated disciple in 2023? Right? Right? To use the self-help language. So I've got a couple of texts that we're going to look at. I had an idea there, and I totally lost it. Whatever, it'll come back to me. So open to Matthew 10 again. going all the way to the end.
Old
Dave?
Testament?
No, the end of 10. Okay, and it's that last paragraph entitled Rewards. You're probably unaware that being a disciple of Jesus has its own rewards program. You collect discipleship miles. You can redeem them for, I don't know, more. Yeah, right, yeah. You can get keychains and stuff. Okay, so I'm just going to read this short little paragraph. Does everybody know where I'm at? Sorry, I have to turn off the verse numbers in order. Whoever welcomes you welcomes me. Whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward.
What's the difference?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. What is the difference? Sorry, I'm fixing my thing. I need to get a wireless mic, Mike.
I was just thinking of that.
Okay. It doesn't work anymore. It died sometime during COVID. Okay, so I'm putting words in our mouth a little bit here. Okay, but I have several passages picked out on purpose. So despite the fact that this small section is seemingly, at least based on the heading title, about rewards, I think this is also an interesting insight into practices. So this comes at the tail end of chapter 10, which is which we were reading from, which is talking about again the commissioning of the disciples, talking about it's Jesus talking to the disciples about what this process is going to look like. He talks about persecution earlier in this passage, so being honest about the reality of the experience that many of these people are going to have. I kind of avoided that on purpose. We can talk about that kind of stuff, but I'll refer to that later. But here at the tail end of that chapter, we've got this interesting passage, which again, if you're one of these folks that are sitting there listening to Jesus, well, let's think about that. What do you think they're hearing here? What do you think these folks are hearing? So theoretically, they've gone out, they've had they haven't necessarily maybe had their internship experience yet.
Is
But-
reward always a good thing?
Yeah, right. Okay, that's an interesting question. Is reward always a good thing? What do you hear in that, Pat? What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, you can punch somebody in the face and make them beat you up and knock you down. That's the reward.
So consequences,
Yeah.
right? That's an interesting way to think about this. Especially since in this as well, so just, Jesus talks about, the upcoming persecutions that the disciples are going to experience. In Matthew, at least, he frames it in this frame of the powers that be aren't going to like you. To make a long story short, you're going to say things and do things that are going to rub up against the standing authority of your faith. Be prepared for that. So in that vein, we talk about reward. Hand in hand with that are, what are the consequences that you're going to experience in this work? Which has a relevance in our modern experience as well, too. Unfortunately, so often in the Christian conversation, we tend to seize that word persecution and we look for it. Again, I'm talking about the big we here. What I mean by that is part of the experience of the early Christian community was one of persecution, right? We all know stories about Nero he's the crazier of the crazy emperors. But if you track the history of the empire and its leaders, from the death of Jesus up through, well, not quite to Constantine, but just before that, you will see intermittent actual persecution, right? So, similar to the Gestapo, arresting people in the middle of the night, you have Roman soldiers rounding up dissenters, right? And that was one of the major things for the Christians, is that they had been presented as a movement which was dangerous to the government, which we have, right? In the modern era. In fact, I was just reading an article this morning about a movie that just came out. It was entitled, maybe they should have picked a different title, it was How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Has anybody heard about this movie? So I'm going to check it out because it seems interesting. But the movie is basically exploring the idea of, obviously climate change is factoring into this, but it's exploring the idea of what is the responsibility of somebody who feels imminently threatened by the onset of climate change, and does that responsibility perhaps stray into doing violence, right? So that the author, well, it's based off a book, but the people who did the movie obviously intended it to be a conversation around this idea. Many more conservative news outlets, however, couldn't get past the title and were basically comparing it to the Bomber's Manifesto, whatever. But the reason I bring that up is that, our dialogue in the 21st century has gotten pretty extreme in that we so often take a community or an identity of people's, and as a way of either discrediting them or simply dehumanizing them, we'll often try to say they're a threat to us, right? This is nothing new, right? Humans have been doing this as long as there have been humans. The Jews, perfect example, the rampant anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages. You can see it there, but any minority group has been done. Christianity was not free from this, right? They were presented as a threat to the empire, which is laughable if you actually look at the practices of those early communities, right? I don't want to make any blanket statements, but I would argue that they weren't necessarily interested with overthrowing the Roman Empire so much as they were interested in practicing their faith. However, the empire, or some aspects of it, decided or was influenced to see that as a threat. That's all. Okay, sorry, this is leading me off of a tangent. Which is an interesting conversation because fast forward a couple hundred years and you have the Christianization of the Roman Empire, which is, you could argue in some ways, is the destruction of the Roman Empire, or at least the empire that existed. Anyways, stop talking, Jesse.
And is it the corruption of Christianity?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I think when you think about reward, be careful what you wish for. I'm sure there were many people who thought, boy, if only we could be the religion of the empire, that'd be great.
Oh, totally. And still think that, right?
Today it's very
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. If only we can be in charge of everybody, everything would be okay.
Right.
Which they've obviously never been in charge of anybody.
Right.
Well, the other thing that's interesting is that often people who are abusers, the people who are abused become the abusers. The people who are persecuted, they become the persecutors.
Oh man. Yeah, absolutely, right? Well, we can track that path in Christianity, right? I mean, and it's tough because granted, the people that were abused or persecuted aren't alive by the time Christianity becomes, in many ways, the abuser, right? But that's kind of a moot point because we're talking about an ideology in a lot of ways too. You could compare a lot of what's going on in Palestine in the 21st century in the same regard. how do you avoid that, right? How do you avoid doing that? Which could be part of this, right? What are the practices that we need to incorporate into our discipleship practice in order to avoid, Pat, as you said, some of the negative consequences that might come about it? Okay, go ahead.
Just the last thought is the idea of reward always sounds so enticing.
Yeah.
But how often does the experience of the reward actually match the experience of hoping for
Yeah.
reward? And I think that's really a crucial question for us today, because the narrative of Christianity has been reduced to, well, you get to eat pie in the sky. And yeah, what does that have to do with us?
Yeah.
Yeah. This world, what's this world for? And the difference between that and hoping in resurrection is huge. Yeah? But it seems to me we make an idolatry an idol out of the reward itself.
So there was a big scandal.
Just throw that.
Yeah, this is great, Paul. This is wonderful. In fact, I think this is one of our practices, is hoping. So they didn't have enough medals for all the marathoners this year. Because a couple of people, well, I don't know exactly how many. Ellen was reading an article, or reading a news story on it. So a couple of people that finished towards the back of the pack, obviously, did not have a medal waiting for them. And were so traumatized that they took to social media to highlight this injustice. This was an experience as well, too, because the days after the race, all over Boston, you see people wearing their medal. And Ellen did not wear her medal. She's like, did I miss the memo? was this a thing? Which I don't want to, obviously, it's a great achievement, right? You should be proud of it. You should be able to wear your medal proudly. We don't wear medals much anymore, right? Unless you're in the military. When do you get an opportunity to wear your medals? I've got tons of medals. I'm like running cross country in high school. When do I get to wear those? Church. In lieu of the cross, I wear my cross country medal. That won't send out mixed signals at all. It's about me, people. It's not about you. Take that too far. But it was funny because this prompted a conversation between the two of us. Was what ended up happening to one woman in particular who complained vociferously about her lack of medal. Another marathon gave her medal, who ran significantly faster than this one who did get that. And I wanted to be present at that conversation. was this I feel so sorry, or is this? Can you just stop tweeting about this? Here's your stupid. But going back to it, right? You weren't necessarily talking about the experience. You're even talking about the hope of the reward as the motivational factor, which is a fascinating idea. Paul, in his epistle to the Corinthians, talks about hope being a virtue, right? Faith, hope, and love, right? And of course, he holds up love as the best of the three. No shocker there. We've heard it a lot of times. But hope as a virtue is what Let's talk about this for a second. What is that? What might that mean? One of the practices of being a disciple is practicing hope. We're not talking about Barack Obama's book, The Audacity of Hope, although that might be an interesting read as well, too.
Well, the Bible is the book of hope. It's the book of faith. It's not a book of science, although there's some science in it.
Bible as a book of hope. There's a lot to that, especially if we look at the prophetic tradition. We look at, pretty much everything in the Old Testament in some way is about the hope of the people of Israel, right? Fleeing Egypt, spending some odd years in the desert, hoping, the promise of the promised land, the reward, but hoping for that, and then when they finally get there, realizing it's not as great as it was panned out to be.
Hope that there can and will be a kingdom of God.
I'm just going to say KOG. Kingdom of God, Kingdom of Heaven. The basileia, the kingdom of the divine, which we talked about a few weeks ago as well too. Susan, what does that mean to you? This idea of the kingdom of God.
That there won't be the kind of tribalism we have
Mm.
now.
Which is an admirable hope, right? I mean, the wondering that you sparked in me there is how has this idea, the kingdom of God, which you could make an argument really is the manifestation of hope, right? We have used the language in here of the way things should be, right, versus the way things are, right? I wonder how that has changed over time. Is the importance of this different for different people?
Well, one thing would be looking at practices.
Yeah.
And you have the kingdom of God. And you have a dichotomy. One is external, which says, this is what I'm going to be doing, and you have to do what I do, or else you don't get the kingdom of God.
Mm.
But the internal is more, to me, a realization that there will not be a kingdom of God until you internalize within you
Ooh,
the preachers, the teachers.
that's some Zen stuff there, Andy. The kingdom of God manifests in me.
Yeah,
I like
that's
that.
when it actually will occur.
Well, and you could make the argument that's partly what we're doing when we're practicing hope.
Yeah, I have a reflection because I think it's the crucial piece that we're missing in our narrative of what Christianity actually is. And we're not actually claiming something very different from Judaism. And I think that's really crucial for us to understand. One help to me was to drop the G in kingdom.
Mm.
And that's not just, silly. It's to say that the kinship of God, the kinship of humanity with God, it's helpful because king is such a loaded term. And to say the kinship of compassion, kinship of non-oppression, really, really helps me to understand what it is we're talking about.
And you could argue, I don't think you need to argue, this idea of kinship is an antidote to tribalism that Susan is talking about.
Especially the idea of suffering, the suffering servant of Jesus, right?
Yes.
That's his main identity, clearly. I don't see anybody would argue that it isn't Isaiah's suffering servant metaphor. And the idea that we too get to participate in suffering servants that's our reward. That's really hard for us to get, to even comprehend. I mean, here we are, most of us here are retired, and in America, we deserve retirement. We work hard for our pension.
Mm-hmm. give me my.
I deserve to play.
Give me my Social Security check and.
Right. So we don't have very much an idea of discipleship in retirement, and I think that's critical for us. I think that we get this blessing of living all these years that people never lived before, and to be healthy in all these years people were never healthy before. What is now our calling as retired? I'm a retired disciple.
Is that a thing? Yeah.
I would disagree with that in the sense that many of us in retirement can do more things of service because we have more time and we enjoy it. We're not suffering service, we're enjoying it.
Well, and not to disagree with you, I think that's what Paul was saying as well too.
You're on my team.
Yeah. Notice it's Paul's team now. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. But there is totally something to that though as well. Is this is part of what has become Christian practice in the modern era, which we see this, okay? How many people hitting retirement age start looking for a faith community again that they may or may not have participated in when they were working, when they had kids, right? This is a thing, right? We believe it or not have quite a few visitors on almost a weekly basis, right? People that are looking for faith communities, right? Not all of them stick around. That's okay. That's part of the seeker process, I suppose. But this points out the reality of this, which is that in a society where we're living into our 70s, 80s, 90s consistently, it changes people's perspective. And what it does, and I'm not saying this critically, by the way. I'm just naming a reality, which is I finally have time to be a Christian now that I'm not working. And there's an interesting thought in that, which is, and it's kind of this, it kind of goes back to this. How do we fit discipleship into our busy work week? Having kids at the same time.
But when you're working with people and you have a lot more connection and you can be a disciple to people because they're right there. I remember I worked over Linwood for 17 years and I don't know, but anyway, people probably knew I went to church anyway. People would come to me and that was fine and I enjoyed it. One time I needed some support from somebody, anybody, but nobody gave it to me.
You just named one of the catch-22 almost of what we're talking about here, which is that in the 21st century, a lot of us choir folks go rehearse. Folks are waiting to have time, and it's not just church either. Waiting to have the time to enjoy your reward, good and faithful servant. They're waiting to have the time to do the things they didn't get to do, right? Travel, I don't know, read, whatever the things are that you're too busy to do. But in here, I wonder if this is a uniquely modern experience with the standard of living and what's the word I'm looking for? The age that people live, whatever. Where we live longer. Okay. I wonder if you were a peasant, in southern France in the 13th century, if you had that kind of relaxed attitude of, well, worry about that stuff when I retire. Of course, peasants didn't retire; they just died because the stresses of labor finally taxed their bodies. Or I wonder if their sense of this was a lot more imminent and urgent, even. Yeah. And this, I say a lot of these things. I'm not necessarily intending this as a critique, but we're building a model. We're talking about modern discipleship, and this is just naming the reality that we exist in, which is that this is a perception, right? Is that I'll do Jesus things when I'm done doing money things or kid things, and that sounds more harsh. Hey, Jim, go.
As being retired, I've often mused on looking back for all those years I was a human doer.
Yeah.
Human doing. And I experience now more a human being. Being meaning who I am, what am I, all the things you were talking about there, that these people who come to visit may be exploring their being. They have time to explore that, who they are, who God is, who Jesus is. When all those years they were putting food on the table and taking care of children, all the doing things which are important. And it turns into the what and why issue too, on what we do versus why we do it. Perhaps a person doesn't want to change a baby's diaper, the what, but they love that child infinitely, the why, the being versus the doing. And I did enjoy playing those two binary thoughts.
Let me reflect this back at you and see if you're vibing it here. What I heard you say is that at some point you transitioned from defining yourself according to your activities
What it is.
to something different. To actually maybe, well, asking this question, who am I, or what does it mean to be? Throw something out there, which is that's profound, because this piece is hard,
But really exciting.
really exciting. This is also our baptismal identity too, right? Nowhere in your baptismal promises is there an if-then clause, right? Nowhere in there does God say that we're speaking the words of God and we're blessing the infant or an adult. Nowhere in there does it say, well, if you perform adequately, then I will claim you as my daughter or son. No, just with the naming of a promise, which is, I think, and I overuse this word, but I think it's profound because to focus on our sense of being, who we are, is also to acknowledge our inherent value, but value as an external thing. Not well, and I don't mean that way, but valued, our valuedness, right? Not our value according to a capitalist. And I have nothing against capitalism, but according to our valuation of the currency, right? But our valuedness, because that for me is the baptismal promise, which is this is God saying, you, at least to me, are of great, great value, right? That's what we say to the child or adult. I think this moving from our activity defining our identity to leaving that behind forces us to reconsider that valuedness.
Let me just take that one step further.
Please.
So we've got in our world and throughout history, we've always had groups of people, and I'm thinking about, say, a Buddhist monk or a cloistered nun or somebody that's kind of set apart from the world and not really, a lot of what we're talking about is sort of being active in the world versus, dialing it back a little bit, being maybe a little bit more in the background than we were when we were working and such. But there are actually large parts of society that have been carved out for people to be more in this being situation rather than being, actively involved, say. And I think that they would regard those as some sort of spiritual practices that they do. Think about, the stories about the nun getting up multiple times during the night.
Yeah.
Is that part of discipleship?
I think it can be.
And how does it fit in?
So here's okay. You're asking a meta question here, which is great. First or second day of this topic, we were drawing a lot of Venn diagrams. One of those is like evangelism and discipleship, and do those two intersect well? The intent behind the foundation, the intent behind the Benedictine orders, right, and the rule of Saint Benedict, which is that's one out of many rules that monastic orders have, was very much influenced by the people that we refer to as the early Christian mothers and fathers, right? And these are people who wanting to explore this, but the language they would have used is wanting to get closer to God, right? Separated themselves from what they perceived as the world. So they left society in order that they might be closer to God. I think there is a validity to that. I truly do. And I think, you articulated it nicely in saying, well, people who participate in a monastic practice have opportunity to consider the implications of things like this, right? You're spending your day working. They work, right? They farm things, they grow things, they make wine. That's part part of the practice as well. But they also get to consider a lot of spiritual questions, right? They pray a lot, write and talk about theology. However, they do it in a bit of isolation, right? Fast forward to the 12th century, and you've got the rise of Franciscan spirituality. It happened before this, but in the 12th century, where it really kind of manifests. Franciscan spirituality, but the mendicant orders, we've used this word, the mendicant orders of monasticism. So this is a marked change. So no longer are you called to be alone in the desert somewhere. The mendicant orders of monasticism are called to be amongst the people, right? So now you have a redefinition of this, wherein the calling to be a monk is the calling to serve a fellow human being. That's at least the Franciscan interpretation. Long explanation, but what I'm getting at is the monastic model is an attempt, I think, to take this and dial it up to 11, right? I think. There's more to it than that. Through Christian history, we have not always come to a consensus as to what that looks like, right? So you use the word set apart, which is what holy means, right? So set apart for a specific purpose. I absolutely think that people participating in a monastic lifestyle are following their own path of discipleship. However, I don't think they have the corner on that market. Okay. And here's why. Pat said something, profound earlier, which I didn't get a chance to come back to, which is that when you're living life, when you're in the world, you are also uniquely poised because you are in the world with other people, right? Whether it's your work colleagues or going to school, you are in community. Okay. One of the things with the monastic orders is that many of them were trying to create ideal communities, right? But in doing so, separated themselves from, well, poverty, suffering, all of these things that exist in the world that even we experience. I think that one of our practices, and we'll next week come up maybe with some verbiage around this, needs to be about immersing ourselves in the sea of humanity. I think it's in the commissioning of the disciples. Jesus says, "I'm going to send you out. I'm not going to send you to a retreat." I think that part of this, for me at least, is about being in relationship, being in community, being in conversation, and not just with people that think and believe like you do. And it's not necessarily to convert them in your way of thinking. For me, it goes back to that curiosity, right? I've got 4 minutes. Okay. So there's a book by a guy named Peter Rollins, I talk about him all the time, I remember that name, called The Orthodox Heretic. It's a collection of parables that he wrote, which in reality is a rethinking or reinterpretation of many of Jesus' parables. So there's one that I always remember. It's I don't remember the title of it, but I'm going to do a really rough outline of it. There's a priest. He is in charge of a small chapel, and one night, late at night, there's a knock on his door, and he goes to the door and he opens it, and out in the patio is standing a devil, a demon, right? Whatever comes to your mind, horns, forked tail, whatever. And the devil on his doorstep says, "Will you give me, or can I come in?" The priest says, "Absolutely, come on in." And then the devil proceeds to destroy the chapel, overturns things, takes a statue, whatever, vandalizes it. And the devil leaves. Next day, late at night, he's knocking at the door, goes outside, the devil's there. The devil comes in and says, "Can I come in?" The priest says, "Yeah, absolutely. I want to, I welcome you in." Rinse and repeat. Okay. This happens a couple of times. I'm messing the story up a little bit. Finally, here's the point of it. The devil comes back. 5th day, 7th day, doesn't matter. Knocks on the door. Priest goes outside. Devil says, will you welcome me into your heart? The priest says, absolutely, all that I have is yours. Devil laughs, leaves. The priest goes to the altar and kneels down and prays and says, God, thank you for showing yourself to me. I wonder how you will appear to me tomorrow. Right? Which seems weirdly strange, but it goes back to this idea of we're called to immerse ourselves in the sea of humanity. That seems like a very easy prospect when it's all people that we share things in common with. The easy people, the people that we don't cross the other side of the street when they're coming down the sidewalk, But I think that this, includes within this something out of that, right? So it's tempting to set ourselves apart and create an ideal community where we aren't challenged or troubled by the questions of the world. But I think one of the things that we're called to do is to actually engage with the troubles of the world, to engage them with a curiosity. Okay. I'm going to wrap up by reading one small piece of scripture. This is going to be your homework for next Sunday. I wrote this word down. The only reason I wrote this down is the passage that we read earlier. This is actually what I intended us to talk about. We did not get to it at all. I kind of shoehorned it in at the last minute, which is, I think, one of the practices, but we can come to a consensus on this. Is welcome or hospitality. We'll talk about that next week since we didn't get to it today. But I want to read the end of Matthew, what chapter am I in? 16. Don't worry about flipping to it. Then Jesus told his disciples, if any of you want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them? Going back to reward again. I'm pointing in general direction, I can't see it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Okay, so here's the homework question I want to leave you with. What does it mean? What does it mean for one of our practices to be taking up the cross? What does that look like? Got it? All right, good. I'm confident that we'll wrap this up next week, but it's a little less confident than I was at the beginning of the hour. So I'm not going to make the announcement yet about the change in topic the first Sunday in May, but it will come soon. All right, see you in worship, everybody. Thanks for yet another great conversation.